Okay, well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jessie Keel. I'm a preservation specialist at the Northeast Document Conservation Center here in Andover, Massachusetts. So that's where I am right now. And I'd like to welcome you to No Budget Preservation Tips and welcome you all to join us today. As I do sort of our introductory bit here and tell you about NEDCC and our plan for the day, I do want to invite you all to throw in some information about yourselves in the chat. Where are you coming from? And I'm particularly interested to hear the type of organization that you're working at. Are you at a small historical society, a university archive, a museum? What size? I think it's nice for you all to see. We have 85 of you here in the room right now. What are the other types of organizations out there right now who are also looking in the same situation as you are for these no budget preservation tips? I think you'd be surprised. Um, at the sizes and situations that people are in who are looking for this advice. So please share that in the chat while we get started. So as I said, I work on the preservation services team at NEDCC, and we offer online trainings and courses throughout the year. We do in-person workshops, preservation assessments, to help folks all across the country with their preservation planning, disaster planning, and more. And then, of course, we also offer paper, book, photo conservation, digital imaging services, and audio preservation services as well. So a whole host of things we do here. Um, and this is sort of our plan for the day, for this next hour at least. We're going to really start by talking about preservation tips that require little to no money. We'll start with a bit of an introduction to preservation theory, what we really actually mean by preservation, and why we do it. And then we'll actually get into the specifics about collection management, how storage and handling are really key to your preservation, and then sort of start to zoom out so that we can talk about your building and environment, but also my favorite topic, which is preparing for emergencies. And my goal is at the end, we'll have some time to just do a quick review, look at some resources, with hopefully some time for Q&A. I also will pause probably periodically to see if there's any questions about things popping up. So don't hesitate to throw questions in. And if we don't get to something during the session today, we'll be able to address it later as well. I'll follow up. Okay, so with that, I'm just gonna take a quick look at the chat here. Thank you all for chiming in. And as I suspected, right, an enormous range here of folks from all sorts of different types of organizations, community museums, larger archives, smaller archives, you name it. So it's just nice to see sort of where everyone's coming from who's here in the room with you right now. So with that, I do just want to get started and jump right in. And we're going to start here with our introduction to preservation. So I really want us to start thinking about, like, take a step back so that we can start thinking about what preservation really is and why we do it. Right? Preservation is the underlying responsibility of any collections caretaker. We are responsible for not only collecting and interpreting and making accessible significant materials, but we're also responsible for the preservation, security, and long-term accessibility of these materials. So this attitude of responsible custody is what we would call it, is really common among all types of collecting institutions. It really can be applied to anyone who has important materials that their goal is to make accessible and available to future generations. So I want us to use today to show and look at ways that we can practically start to care for our items and our collections in really broad, big picture ways, right? The simple steps that we can take to improve storage, to protect our collections, and in the end, provide better access to them. Preservation has a lot to do with knowing your collections, and then using that knowledge to prioritize the materials that actually need the most help to survive. And for, circulating library collections, for example, obviously there's less of a need for archival standards and your shelving and access policies, your climate management. But I know that there are a lot of libraries, for example, that have special collections mixed in there that require care. A lot of this advice can be adapted to fit an enormous variety of circumstances. And then definitely for like local history collections, if you have rare books, unique items, we really want to start to think about making sure that, no matter your size, no matter if you're volunteer run, that you are doing the work to establish some of the basic policies for care and handling that are going to help really do a lot of work to protect and care for your most valuable items. So preservation, right, is really what I'm trying to say is it's integral to any part of your collecting institution's mission. And the preservation needs and goals are really part of the overall strategic plan. So that doesn't mean, right, the whole goal of today is that we don't think that this means that you have to start spending a lot of money on preservation projects. I think proposing some of these initiatives at your organization can really immediately turn people off. We're like, well, we don't have the money to do some of this. But nobody here, big or small organization, huge university, tiny, small museum, nobody has their ideal budget that affords to do all of the preservation work that they want to be doing at every minute. I have yet to meet an institution who's like, oh yeah, we're not worried about our budget or about money, right? So we're all here today because there are actions and we can be strategic in thinking about how we spend the money we do have and how we spend our other resources like time and energy to make sure that we are preserving our collections and caring for them, no matter like the size or scope or budget of our institutions. So with that, here is just a quick summary of some basic preservation concepts, right? We understand that we owe our collections special care because they're unique, because they mean something to us. So that is, again, that ideal idea of responsible custody. So we understand that our collections are fragile, but that there are actions that we can take to make them more resilient through by stabilizing them and then by protecting them from other types of deterioration. So obviously, there is no way to totally stop our materials from deteriorating, but we can slow that down significantly in some cases through effective preservation planning, through following established policies. And you're going to hear me talk more about policy today than I'm sure you ever wanted to hear. And so we're going to revisit these ideas as we go through our no budget preservation activities today. I want to say that one major caveat is that when an issue becomes a problem that is out of scope, you have to be realistic about it and know when to seek expert advice and when to try to budget for additional services, right? So while we're focusing today on preservation activities that I think you all can start today, that you can start tomorrow, even with no budget line for preservation, it is important to recognize that eventually your entire preservation program is never going to be completely free of cost. At some point, to continue to do the work, you will have to spend some amount of money at some point. So even the things that we think about as being free, are still valuable resources like your existing space, your supplies, and then I obviously think of your time. I mean, it's free, but also sometimes, um, your time is part of this overall budget of staffing and employment and things like that. So it's not as always as simple as no budget. So what is within our no budget scope? I really want to kind of narrow our focus down to actually address like to focus in on what we can address today and what doesn't really fall within no budget. So obviously, as I sort of hinted at, this is going to be your biggest things are going to be preservation planning and policy. These are kind of administrative tasks that, cost us time and effort, but not a specific dollar amount. And so on this slide, the scope of our no budget activities are going to really focus in on 1 and 2, as I said in our agenda, storage and handling, building an environment. We're not really going to be talking about number 3 today, right? Conservation, reformatting, and exhibition. Not because they're not important considerations in your overall preservation planning and management of your collections, but because they're really never going to be accomplished for free. I would say all three of those items under number 3 require some amount of money. So that won't be our focus today. We'll focus in on 1 and 2. I know I mentioned the idea of responsible custody already a couple of times now, but I want to take a quick second to kind of dig in a little bit more on what I actually mean when I say responsible custody. Um, excuse me. This really describes a level of environmental control, housing, care, and maintenance that will slow further chemical deterioration and protect materials from physical damage. So these preventative measures include your climate management, includes your protective enclosures for materials, fire detection and suppression, security of your collection, disaster planning, and then also training your staff and users on how to handle collections appropriately. And so we'll touch on a lot of those elements today. The thing I really want you to remember, and I know this is hard, especially when you are one person at an organization, is that preservation works best when it's programmatic, not when you're kind of tackling it here and there, but when you're able to kind of put in a plan and a set of policies that are really comprehensive, right? So, we're talking about managing and planning for preservation. At a big level, as well as at those individual activities that are contributing to a preservation program, right? So doing things like preparing a written guide to manage your records and materials, but also, discrete activities like rehousing your paper-based items into supportive, high-quality enclosures. And again, you might be thinking, well, high quality supportive enclosures, those are pricey. That requires a budget. And you are, of course, correct. But there are steps in between donation and that rehousing that you can do and should be thinking about without spending a lot of money until you have the ability to purchase those enclosures that are the kind of goal. So those kind of intermediary steps that, sometimes I think we can overlook because if we can't do the perfect best thing, like what's the point? But they are really what are making up our preservation programs. These are the activities we're doing. They take planning and time and effort, but again, not necessarily always a lot of money. And so that is sort of that sweet spot that we're going to try to be addressing today in a couple different ways. So with that, again, just another way for us to sort of kind of comprehend the areas of focus and the way and kind of how to strategize through this program or this preservation plan. So we're going to start here with these first two, right? These are sort of the administrative aspects of preservation planning, and they're formalized when you work through an organization. But also I would encourage, if you are a private collector attending today, or maybe you're just managing your family's, papers, there are certain administrative level strategies and practices that you can use in your own personal life for your own personal, items that you would like to preserve. A thorough awareness and articulation of your goals and objectives for your collection as a whole, right? What your organization wishes to document, who it wishes to serve, what types of materials you collect to accomplish these goals, right? All of these things provide the underpinning for preservation actions. This broad understanding provides context to support your preservation decision making. And it should be made clear and explicit and written down in your policies and planning, whether formal or not. You want to get that stuff out of paper and out of just your head, even if you know it really well. Put that on paper. So again, we're thinking of these first two tabs here that I've starred as administrative infrastructure. So these are your mission, your staffing, leadership, strategic planning, all of those managerial tools and activities that allow your organization to run. Of course, we are kind of skipping that little chunk within there that is going to talk about staffing and budgets. It's important to how your organization functions, but not within the scope of our conversation today. And then effective preservation planning also requires that you prioritize your various materials for preservation based on factors like use, storage environment, condition, value, and format. So that's where this kind of idea of intellectual control comes into play. So we'll focus here on intellectual control. So these are your catalogs, your inventories, the tools that help you search your collection and make priorities based on subject, age, resource, as well as any type of accessioning and background information about your collections. They also provide a record of what you have, which supports selection for access as well as for preservation. So they support and bolster the security of your collections, which is another incredible and important benefit. And so then the final piece of your management and planning, right, you need to establish a level of intellectual control. And I know I'm sure I'm talking right now to organizations that have not completed an inventory, but that is really such an important step in your preservation planning and everything is to have some level and some degree of intellectual control, right? So, documentation of ownership. It's really critical to prevent damage, disorder related to use and access. It's maintaining intellectual links between materials. And in the context of disaster recovery, it's so important for you to be able to determine materials that have been damaged or destroyed for lots of reasons, but one of which being insurance reasons, right? So I don't want you to forget that intellectual control is really critically linked to physical control, right? The record keeping, retrieval, and shelving practices that are ensuring that the materials are where they are supposed to be. Okay. So that is our kind of introduction, setting the stage for how we're going to think about the rest of the topics. And now we're going to kind of move into storage and handling. I'm going to see if there's any questions. Feel free to throw any questions in the chat. Leah suggests, recommending a local supply exchange group. They made one for NYC so they can exchange and borrow supplies when money and access are a challenge. Okay. That is such a great idea. I know I have worked and I have seen a number of organizations that, you over purchase like one size box or, something and you're just like holding on to the extras because you think you might use them for a project someday. Sometimes they're just like taking up space. So definitely, matching the extra supplies you have with other organizations and vice versa is an amazing idea. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so on to storage and handling. So I want to start with, again, this sort of narrower vision of thinking about preservation. And I think the really obvious place is, storing, handling that basic care and interaction we have with our collections. And so in sort of, there's four arenas we're seeing on screen here. Arenas is a weird word, but how we think about caring for our collections. Obviously, the storage space, the use spaces that we have, and our furniture are incredibly important, but usually conversations around those can sometimes, again, end up being a lot about funding and money, improving your space. A lot of times you are stuck in a space and you don't have a lot of options about it. So instead, I want to get pretty narrow and talk about how we're preparing our materials during accessioning, processing, and housing. And it gets a little nitpicky, right? You're starting to think and ask yourself questions like, what level of preparation does this specific item need for safe storage and handling? Are there post-it notes stuck on collection items? Are you removing your staples and paper clips? Is that like written in a policy somewhere that's how you're processing collections? Do you have storage furniture that is appropriate for this oversized giant framed item or map? But maybe you have no flat file storage. Do you have the right enclosures? Sort of the same idea. And do those enclosures fully enclose, providing the right kind of protection against pests, dirt, light, environmental fluctuations? I see a lot of, when I'm doing visits, items in the wrong size enclosures. And I definitely think that's usually better than no enclosure, but sometimes the wrong size is causing physical damage. And so it's definitely a challenge there. And then, what do you actually have the time and ability to do without much in the way of money, right? And so we're going to focus here on like the no cost things that you can do to kind of fix your preparation. And again, these might seem like really small things, but because they're really small, they should be really easy to actually fix. And I promise you that they make a big difference, actually. So with that, I'm going to start with, I have do's and don'ts, and we're going to start with the don'ts, but then we'll move into the do's. So while chemical and biological agents of deterioration are sort of broad environmental causes of damage, we ourselves, or maybe our predecessors, also obviously inadvertently cause problems through improper storage. And so that's usually kind of the mechanical form of damage or deterioration. So when you look at your storage, really analyze and try to, as best as possible, kind of apply some fresh eyes to the situation, to consider how your setup is affecting your materials, right? On the screen, we're seeing some items that are, stacked on top of each other. The shelving's overburdened. You can see in this case, items are putting a lot of pressure on those below them. They're overhanging the edge. Um, all of this is going to impede your access. It's really hard to get at and figure out what is in this kind of haphazard pile. And obviously you have to handle everything to get at one thing. So you have more risk of damage. And obviously in the situation it's in, is possibly causing damage to those materials. But we also see this again, like you could be looking at, maybe you'd have everything boxed and you're like patting yourself on the back. You're like, great, I have everything in enclosures. I'm looking at a shelf full of boxes. How often do you go in those boxes? Definitely take some off the shelves and really familiarize yourself with how people before you filled those enclosures, because I can't tell you how many times, I walk into an archive space, a storage space, and I have like beautiful boxes. Everything looks really good, but I start to open enclosures, and again, as I said, find stuff that isn't fit right, or it's only half full, and all the papers are something over. Um, again, that's a no. But other than time, that is a no budget thing to start thinking about and addressing, and then trying to rectify as you rehouse and process other items. Uh, don't use stickers or adhesive labels to identify items. This is a big one in organizations that are also libraries, because it's very standard, right, to apply adhesive labels. But you don't want any tape, sticky labels, adhesive folders, anything with adhesive, we don't want on our rare books and materials. So instead of what those stickers you're seeing on the one side of the screen, attaching your barcodes or anything that you with an adhesive label, you can put that on a book flag, that's acid-free paper, and tuck that into a volume so that you can still use like a barcode system, but that you haven't actually put anything on the volume itself. What I'm not telling you to do right now is to just like go into your storage space if you have these and start ripping labels off of your books. I think it's just going to at this point cause more damage than anything. But if this was a practice at your organization, or still a practice, I would definitely not do it moving forward, and start to, as you move forward or as labels come off, move into this new system. Don't store oversized items in inappropriate or unprotected spots. Yeah, oversized items are definitely a common one. They're really hard. I think they always get the short end of the stick. They get shoved behind doors. They're put on top of shelves with no protection or support. So we really want to, as creatively as possible, if we're accepting oversized items, think about how we can fix that. Um, so something to think about while we're talking about not having a budget is the fact that, it will cost more in the long run, to take care of these things after they've been stored poorly, right? If you don't take action now or do it right now, yes, you're saving a little bit of money because you're not spending, money on like a new enclosure piece of furniture. But if you damage the item and then you need to repair it later, that's conservation work is way more expensive than the appropriate box or piece of furniture. And so the photos are really examples of things we see all the time on site visits, right? Oversized posters, maps, blueprints, they're rolled up and stuffed in all types of cabinets. Um, and I get it, but again, we want to be thinking about where are the spaces. I mean, first of all, being strategic about what we accept in the first place, if we can't reasonably care for items. But of course, we're stuck with the stuff that's already been accepted. So trying to not put our oversized items on like the highest, most out of the way spot, and trying to get some form of correct enclosures is really critical. I'm just looking at the questions. The problem with flags is that they sometimes get lost. So what is another alternative? Yeah, so I guess if they're in an enclosure, it can just go on the outside of the enclosure. Um, they can get lost. I mean, that's definitely a risk. I think training your staff and talking about your access and handling policies are the best way to address those two things becoming disassociated. Unprotected spaces. I really mean like in this image on screen where all of those rolled items are on top of the cabinet. I think the biggest thing we see is oversized items because they're so awkward, being stored on top of cabinets or shelving. And that is a space where I mean, all sorts of stuff end up there, framed items. Um, and being on top of shelving, you're not protected by the shelf itself. And so you're exposed to, like, if your sprinklers went off, if there was an issue, that's the first stuff that's going to be affected. So that's sort of what I mean. Uh, I'm going to leave the question about photos and albums to the end. That is sort of a general question, and I can address that. Great question. Okay. Don't fold or roll collections materials. I think this one's probably pretty obvious. But again, I think my general point here is, all careful handling is something that, we sort of know in the back of our head is, of course, best practice. But we could really think about as, a critical way to keep our items safe so that we can have to avoid damage and conservation work and things like that. So having the best handling practices. So again, no folding, rolling documents, really in general, if we can avoid rolling things that are not already rolled, if you have things that are flat, store them flat, because it's more money to get the right kind of tubes and polyester sheeting and do all of the things right to store items rolled. If they're already rolled at this point, I wouldn't try to flatten them. That's also its own issue, but definitely taking the time to do your handling procedures correctly is a good move. Somebody says they can't see items I'm referring to on screen. Maybe I'm just not being clear at which pictures I'm talking about. But there's only two images on screen right now. And then somebody asks, how do you treat photos that prior people have rolled inappropriately? It's a great question. I technically don't recommend trying to do a lot of flattening things yourself. I would, at the very least, depending on the type of photograph, its value in your collection, at least consult the advice of a photograph conservator, who may give you some advice on how to like best handle photographs, especially because they can be so sensitive and fragile. So I wouldn't necessarily try a lot of things yourself, and I don't feel like I could give the best practice photograph flattening advice. But if you had like specific questions, I would be happy to put you in contact with our photograph conservator, who might have some, expertise on that specific format and some best advice. Okay. You all have so many great questions. I am going to keep going. I will come back to these questions at the end. I just want to make sure we get through all the content, and then I will answer as many questions as possible at the end. But please don't hesitate to keep putting them in. I will come back to them. So I want to also look at our do's, the positive things that we can be doing that maybe we're already doing or should be doing that we want to make sure happen. So the first one really has to do with our processing, right? You need to decide what's realistic for your institution, for the size and nature of your accessions and donations. Obviously, this is a process that can be really time consuming, and you've got to make sure you have volunteers who are trained to carefully do certain things, like removing your paper clips. So that's what we're seeing on screen, right? Do remove rubber bands, paper clips, sticky notes, little extra bits like that. Sometimes it's like really easy to remove paper clips, but if it's a one like what we're seeing on screen where it's sort of rusted and corroded and like almost attached itself to the paper. You do have to be really careful. So maybe that's like not an assignment that every volunteer has. But if you've trained, your volunteers and how you want it safely done, that's fine. I don't recommend the plastic paper clips that you're seeing on screen, those little colorful plastic ones. They won't rust, but they are still going to like leave physical indents on your paper documents. Um, so we like to replace clips with folded sheets of acid-free paper, just folded in half around the sheets that were previously clipped together. It doesn't have to be complex, something to show what the grouping was, but that is getting that metal out of your collection. The same thing with staples, old folders, paper, not old folders, I mean rubber bands, because those will deteriorate as well. And definitely get rid of your sticky notes. I don't know if I have sticky notes somewhere else in here, but I don't, the color bleeds out of those if your collections get wet. And do also remove other plastic bags, old containers, right? Unprocessed collections can end up with you, and they can have, dirty grocery store bags, old manila envelopes, receipts, stuff that's not archival or part of the collection. So you need to get rid of those. And again, this is all dependent on your staff power, your prioritization. But the best, getting rid of the stuff that you will not be rehousing or using, putting into your collection helps simplify a lot of things. And do retain any original descriptions, labels, other accompanying information, right? You do want to remove, um, the old envelopes, bags, little sticky notes. I, once got a collection just full of like the person had put like important sticky notes on each book. And I wanted that information. I do not, again, want that sticky note there. So mixed in with these collections, they have that's important contextual information. So do keep track of those items, right? But you can take that item, you can transcribe the information, you can photocopy it, you can take a picture of it, capture it however you want, but you do, especially if it has adhesive on it, or is, acidic paper, separate those items from your rare books and artifacts and things like that. And then do use only archival materials, right? Your acid-free, lignin-free, and usually for most materials, buffered materials. And I know this is sort of like my one, I'm cheating a bit here. I don't think this is necessarily no budget. But if you do end up with, funding to purchase supplies, definitely purchase the right ones. Purchasing non-archival supplies because it's a little cheaper and your money goes a little bit farther is going to be more of a preservation headache in the long run. And especially for certain items like your photographs. So I guess this kind of addresses maybe that photo album question. Anything that you are storing your photographs in should ideally pass the photographic activity test, and you'll see it should, like on that listing for the item, say passed the PAT, should have like a little seal. And so that's a good, indicator that you're storing your photographs in the correct way. Now, I will say if you inherited a bunch of photo albums and the photos are already arranged in that album, it's a different set of questions about whether it makes most sense to keep them in that original form. What type of photographs are they? Does it make sense, and do you have the capacity to actually rehouse them? In the long run, that's probably better preservation for the photograph. But I think if your initial decision is that they have to remain in that photo album, that's also, a preservation strategy to weigh there about what you're actually able to do. So again, these do's and don'ts really apply to how you're thinking about the initial processing and handling of your collections. They're just some kind of initial examples and big buckets of recommendations. And I'm sure it's all information you are all aware of. But I think that they're not always enforced or made standard practice at your organizations. It may be something you all sort of know you're supposed to be doing and maybe are doing, but is it written down anywhere? Right? How are we making sure these are happening? And how do you make sure they happen? Maybe what's best, but what if you leave that organization? How is that work going to continue? And so, this is where I'm going to make that statement about how important your policies are. Written and documented policies other than your staff time to create them, are free to create. And they are so critical to ensuring this preservation work happens, right? So think about ground rules that benefit your materials the most. What are the biggest things you can be doing? And then document those. And make sure it is clear and explicit to anyone who's going to be doing this work with your collections, from volunteers to the users who may, come and handle your collections as they access them. That's going to really set you all up for long-term preservation success. Okay, we're going to move on to building an environment. And again, yeah, I think we'll just keep going. I'm seeing a lot of great questions and also answers here in the chat. And any specific questions we will address at the end. Thank you all, though, for throwing them in there. So the next really critical aspect as we're zooming out of your preservation program is the physical infrastructure, right? The building, the spaces that are holding your collections, as well as the kind of systems that are part of those, right? That are affecting and controlling your storage environment. So we look at the building and the environment for the purposes of preservation, right? An important, well-maintained building is a really important first line of defense, right? Your building is sort of like the first enclosure, or the first box that is then protecting all of your other, boxes and spaces within it. So if your structure isn't sound, it's not going to prevent the entrance of pests. It's not going to prevent security intruders. It's not going to support good climate control of your space, protect you from disasters. And so there's a lot of, regular maintenance and walkthroughs and simple activities we can put in place that are going to do a lot to benefit our collections. So let's think about our building spaces a little bit more concretely, right? Where do you have your collection stored? What are those spaces like? Are you using offsite storage? Are materials in the stacks while some are, extra stuff is tucked away in a forgotten basement and attic? And I know I'm talking to people who've been, put in the basement by their organization with all of those problems. And in these pictures we're seeing on screen, right, we're seeing some less than ideal storage environments. In that first image, we're seeing open windows that could bring in pollutants in the air. We see record cartons hanging off of shelves. Maybe it's been knocked into, maybe somebody's pushed something from the other side of the shelf. And then in that last picture, we're seeing, your average typical attic storage, right? It's organized, but I'm still seeing items on the floor, which isn't great. I'm seeing a lot of brown cardboard, which is not, ideal. It can be very acidic. Some items look kind of like rolled haphazardly. So there are a lot of small things here that we're seeing that are going to cause preservation problems down the line. So you do want to be doing an annual building inspection. And, annual is great. If you're, quarterly, better. I think like as seasons change, it's usually a pretty good idea to do an inspection of your building. And also your environmental control systems if you have any, right? Your HVAC system, essentially. But this really depends on, right, your area, the climate of the part of the United States that you're in, or whatever country that you're in. So part of every site visit that we do includes a building walkthrough. I'm walking around the outside of the building. I'm looking at, details of the inside. And so, whether you're doing your disaster planning, training staff, walkthroughs are such a powerful thing, especially if you can kind of enter the mindset of really intensely focusing on trying to see things with new eyes, because we're in our buildings and our spaces every day, and it becomes so easy to just not see things, especially if they're changing. Are you looking and assessing for spaces that are underused or could be repurposed? You might have like a different focus for each walkthrough. In the spring, maybe you're reviewing evacuation routes. In the fall, maybe you're looking for building conditions that are going to affect your preparedness for winter. It depends on your needs, but just taking the time to look and assess everything, maybe with your facility staff, can be so useful. It's not going to always, end up being completely free. Maybe you need to bring in a facilities, staff member. Maybe that will cost money. But you doing some initial assessment and walking around is free. And basic maintenance, again, can cost money, but doing small maintenance tasks now, right? Replacing a few roof tiles, having your drains cleaned, those are going to prevent very large, very expensive problems down the line. Deferred maintenance is probably one of the number one causes of larger scale water issues at organizations. This includes checking, your fire extinguishers as you do walkthroughs. Make sure your batteries and your alarms are updated. Again, these are all really little things, addressing cracks, addressing water issues. But monitoring them, documenting them, and following up can do so much to save you problems down the line. And our storage conditions are really affected by the integrity of our building and our environmental systems, right? And we really are, of course, concerned about our temperature and relative humidity and air quality in our spaces. Heat, moisture, air pollutants, all of them can have an enormous impact on the chemical, mechanical, and biological decay in the rate at which our materials age. So the first thing to do is really to inform yourself and learn about what the conditions are in your storage. Monitoring the environment, knowing your risks, can be done on a low budget. I'm not saying you need to immediately go out and buy environmental data loggers if you aren't already using them. You can do some close observation of your materials, right? Archival materials like paper are hygroscopic, right? They're absorbing and releasing moisture. So they will respond to seasonal changes. If you are seeing physical changes in the paper in your collection, you will have an indicator that you're having an issue with your HVAC. You probably already have a way to kind of see what the temperature is in the space. Assessing those things, getting even the most basic way to monitor the relative humidity and temperature, like a really inexpensive monitor, all of that. It doesn't have to be like a very expensive, fancy environmental monitoring program to get some sort of way to start understanding your current conditions. The more equipment you can get, the better you can understand those trends. But if you have once you start to understand those trends, if you have one space that is maybe more stable than others, if you have, some storage in a basement or an attic, and you have some storage in a primary space that has the best kind of control over its temperature and relative humidity, be strategic about what is stored in each space. That costs no money to use your storage space strategically, depending on the natural fluctuations in temperature and humidity. So you're right, you're relocating collections to the most stable areas for your most important collections, your things that respond most significantly to temperature and humidity changes, and maybe, you have some other less sensitive items or less important items that are put in that attic or basement storage. And of course, it's not just your temperature, relative humidity, and air quality that pose risks. We also want to look at the ones related to light exposure, right? All light is damaging, UV light especially so. We've all seen photographs, prints that are faded because they were sitting in a sunny room for years on end. So you really want to consider the amount of light to which your materials are exposed. So are your lights frequently left on in storage areas? Are there windows? Do you have shades that can be drawn? Are you using fluorescent lighting? You probably already have general budget for like light bulbs in your organization. So making sure that you're using LED light bulbs when possible. It's probably something your facilities people are doing anyways, but checking in on that is really important. And also like really obvious ones like shutting off your lights when no one's around, keeping shades closed when possible. Those are all really little things, but make a big impact over time. And then security, right? Your building security as a whole, along with storage area protections and usage practices, are important considerations, right? who has access to your collection spaces and when. And I think this is a spot where there are usually a lot of improvements that organizations can do that don't really involve money. This is not just, not all organizations have really high-end security systems with cameras and key cards. It's not the reality for most organizations, but there's a key aspect for good collections management and security, which is that intellectual control that I mentioned at the beginning. The biggest thing that you can do is actually have a good quality understanding of the items that you have so that you understand, so that you would even notice if there was a security concern or if something had gone missing. Um, and then really obvious stuff like ensuring that you have opening and closing procedures, and that staff are trained to keep your windows and doors locked. You would be surprised by how many times kind of a casual attitude towards this at organizations where there's a lot of like trust and familiarity, that really basic stuff like that are isn't followed. If you have locking cabinets, right? Which ones should be locked, when, who has the keys, doing even a basic key inventory and ensuring that you understand who has keys and who needs that kind of access. All of that is really important. Um, oh, I got ahead of myself. This is information about doing a key survey, right? Figure out, which keys open which doors and who has access. This is always a question that we ask when we're doing site visits, and you'd be surprised at how many people like start to add up who has keys or who has a master key that unlocks everything. And they sort of like are amazed, like, I didn't even think about that so and so actually has access. Or I've worked at organizations that really relied on a lot of padlocks for stuff, and they used the same like 4-digit combination for all the padlocks, and they had used that 4-digit combination forever. It was like half the town knows what the 4-digit code is to open, various gates and things like that. So, doesn't cost money, but does cost some time and effort, and documentation to kind of keep track of these really important security concerns. And then, of course, your practices involving researchers and patrons for security, right? Who are your users? What materials are they accessing? Um, Ideally, probably don't have like a perfect reading room always, but making sure that your visitors and researchers are always attended, that they're working within your view, um, and that you have, proper sign-in sheets for who's accessing spaces and when. This doesn't have to be fancy forms or a lot of documentation. There are so many examples online that you can borrow from to have a user registration form and things like that. And finally, consider how your housekeeping and pest management practices come into play here. We really want to be thinking again about keeping track of, noticing pest issues. This is another key point in your walkthrough. But also, the biggest thing you can do, right, is really enforcing a no food or drink policy in your collection storage spaces. I think it's pretty standard to enforce that, but having garbage cans in strategic places, making sure they're emptied, and just having a written and enforceable policy goes a long way to preventing pest issues from even happening in the first place. And so our final topic of the day, which we have just enough time to handle, is emergency planning. And again, I said this is sort of my favorite thing. I think this is, an easy thing to overlook, but actually is like the perfect example of a no budget activity that has a big impact on your collection when the time comes. And so these are sort of the 6 critical, things that you can do. The key here, though, with all of them, right, is working within your existing resources. Disaster planning can become something that's resource intensive. People pay consultants, they buy tools, they buy supplies. But there is, again, so much that you can do within what you already have access to. So I'm just going to hit through these 6 really quickly, with some additional details, right? You want to write and update your disaster plan. And I know this is the one people can be like, oh, I know that, but there's all sorts of hurdles and delays and staff timing that make this a real challenge. But again, this is a disaster plan as a resource assessment. Who and what do you have to help you respond to an emergency? you're just bringing all of those elements together in one easy to access space, right? Um, there are a lot of scenarios, and I think there's a lot of ways to make disaster planning. It can be really complicated, especially if you let yourself kind of run with all the hypotheticals and feel really overwhelmed. Um, but there are some really basic templates out there that you can follow to just get the beginning of these initial resources in place. You can always refine and add to it later, make a, improve it as time goes on. But getting those basic resources of who and what you will need for most disaster scenarios is a pretty simple assembly of resources. And we have some resources to share with you at the end of this. Um, then the one thing I really want everyone to do is create this pocket response plan. This is sort of not your full disaster plan, but is sort of a one-page collection of the key contact information and key actions that everyone can have folded up like you see here on screen and stuck into their wallet. And there is a link in this slide deck of where you can get to this template online to fill this out. So if there's one thing I could get everyone to do, it's to work on this pocket response plan. It's the perfect first step to take in disaster planning before you get to the time to work on your larger plan, to get you started and have something in place. Conduct your annual fire drills, talk to your fire department, do a walkthrough with them, make sure all of your staff know how to evacuate a building if there's a fire, making sure your fire alarms have, the batteries updated. Does everyone know where the fire extinguishers are? All of this is really basic stuff that isn't going to require any money, but does a lot in terms of having a safe response to an emergency. And then number 4, lift all of your materials off the ground. That is another really big thing. If you have boxes sitting on the ground, which I'm sure a lot of you do, I've not been to an organization that doesn't have something on the ground. It happens, of course. But if you can do anything to get your items, I think 4 is really nice. 3 is good too. That's what I say. That's why we say it here on screen. Get it off the ground. It will do so much to prevent your items from getting wet if there's a water incursion that happens at the floor level, like those boxes you're seeing on screen. And then, review and organize your emergency supplies. You could spend a lot of money going out to buy supplies, and eventually, I think budgeting yourself for some disaster supplies is a great idea. You don't need to buy like a fancy spill kit like you're seeing on screen here. You can spend the time to understand like what you already have on hand, because I'm sure most of you already have some plastic sheeting, some gloves, a flashlight, little things like that that you can collect together and store in one 5-gallon bucket that you already have, so that it's located together, or just notated in your plan where certain things are so that you can have an effective response. So be creative with the materials that you already naturally have at your organizations. And then you can plan ahead for what items you would eventually like to add to a more robust disaster supply kit. And then finally, this is kind of a rehashing of what we talked about earlier, though, which is, doing a walkthrough that is really specifically focused on emergency management, right? Are you really assessing the risks that could cause big problems later on? So doing a walkthrough really focused on that is helpful. So with that, we just went through so much information. We're really trying to pack in a lot here. But I tried to then distill it down. I was like, oh, if I could only have everybody walk away with like 4 no budget things, actions that they were going to take, kind of what would I make them be? Um, my number one, and I guess is a little bit me, is really doing that pocket response resource. I think that is a free thing that everyone could do on Friday tomorrow, and then get to enjoy their 3-day Memorial Day weekend knowing they've crossed something off the list. Or at least start it, download the template and put in, fill out your title of your organization. Even that's good. Getting your materials off the ground or thinking about it, starting walkthroughs, and then kind of starting to think about how you're going to apply those best practice actions, which I sort of summarized there. We talked about a lot of other things that are not these 4 things, but I sort of said, let's distill it down into the 4, in my mind, biggest impact items, for as little budget as possible. And then on these next two slides, we have some kind of key resources. On this slide here, this link, let me highlight it with my laser. The D-Plan Arts Ready free resources. If you click on this link, this is what's going to take you to where you can download. I mean, it's going to have a lot of free disaster resources, but where you can download that pocket response plan. And then on this screen, I just want to highlight, I again hope a lot of you know some of these resources already, but the National Park Service Conservagram series is such an excellent resource. And then we also have a preservation leaflet series. I send these leaflets out to folks all the time. They are so useful as a first place to get some basic preservation advice, in addition to our Preservation 101 online textbook. Completely free textbook, breaks down all of these preservation areas and concepts for you. So those are resources I recommend bookmarking, keeping as ready reference as you do your preservation work. So with that, we've got here to the end. We have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to go to the chat to look at questions. I'll say a couple things. One, if I don't get to your question today, feel free to email us, the info@nedcc. Those emails will make their way to me or another preservation specialist when you need advice. Please sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. And I know at least somebody did ask, these slides are on the learning, the training hub where you logged in to view this. Those slides are up there so that you can have them. And then we will also the recording to this will be on YouTube, and there'll be a link so that you can get to the slides from there too. So you'll have these so you can click on those hyperlinks that we just looked at. So with that, I'm going to try to scroll back up and see where we sort of left. Okay, so somebody said, do you keep photos in albums? We addressed that. Don't flatten rolled items. I mean, ideally, it's usually the best storage. I would just say from a no budget perspective, it's not necessarily like a high priority task to flatten everything. Depending on how fragile the item is, it can be really difficult, and you may want to consult, especially I'm talking about paper items, consult with a paper conservator before you just try to flatten items. We have spacing issues with a lot of oversized items, huge maps. Is there a recommendation that would save space? Would properly rolled ones save space? You say like oversized items, like huge maps. I don't know how big.
Glad.
Oh, if everyone could just stay on mute. Well, actually, I could. Okay. I'm making sure folks are on mute. Okay.
Your Kelly's and oh man, he's tied in all these things.
Okay. So if they're so big that, like, in my mind, a flat file storage is really usually an efficient way to store oversized items, unless we're talking about maps that are so big that like doesn't make any sense. And in that case, rolling probably does make sense. But again, I would consult, depending on a lot of it's really hard, and I hate that it's like I'm always like, well, it depends. It does really depend on the item and how valuable it is to your collection, because there's a lot of stuff that goes into storing items rolled, especially if they're not already rolled. And so again, I think consulting with a paper conservator to ask their opinion and advice is like the best case scenario. Depending on if it's not like key to your organization, if it's low on your list of worries, your decision, like the decision there is a little bit less, like the stakes are less high. So if you can properly store them rolled, that's fine. But if it's a really important map, really rare, really fragile, I would just put a little more thought into it and consult a paper conservator. Okay, we're figuring out how to see stuff. My organization doesn't even have shelves. Everything is hanging in hanging folders. It drives me bonkers. Why even buy the shelving unit if you aren't going to put it in shelves? If we're talking about like hanging folders in a filing cabinet, that's, if it's not our ideal situation, but that's pretty stable. So I don't know what the specific question is here necessarily. But definitely if things are in a stable kind of enclosed environment like a filing cabinet, that's depending on what they are, it's probably okay for now as you sort of investigate and try to improve your shelving situation. Rubber bands will melt. Yeah. We all, yes. Plastic clips, rubber bands, we're all anti them. What about sticky notes on enclosures? I really don't like to see any sticky notes in any archive. Because as I said, they will, I mean, one, because they fall off. And so if that's the thing that's telling you what box that is or what information's in that box, it can just fall to the ground and then you don't know what, that label is for that box anymore. So it's a bad labeling strategy for enclosures. Also, because we teach a lot of wet salvage and I will get a sticky note and I'll get it wet. And especially like pink ones, that dye immediately runs out and it will stain folders, boxes, items that it is near. So there's so many reasons that I just no sticky notes. Which is hard because I personally, in my personal life, like on my personal documents, love sticky notes. I'm really pro sticky note for organization, just not in an archival collection storage space. Somebody says, what about spiral bindings? I would need more information. I don't know what the specific question is there. So Samantha, if you want to chime in with what you mean. Somebody says, I've assumed that we would need a conservator to deal with the spine labels and barcodes that have been placed on and inside our rare books in the past, but want to ask just in case, is there something I can do myself? You are right, Elizabeth, that I would really recommend having a conservator remove those items. Especially, I mean, again, being aware that we're talking about no budget, having a conservator remove them costs money. For your really rare materials that the condition and the effect of getting that adhesive off is really important, it is absolutely worth budgeting and creating a way for a conservator to do that. If that is, or leaving them is also another good option. Those are kind of your two best options. Leaving them costs no money for now, and eventually having a conservator do something is really your best option eventually. Guidelines for handling books while photographing them from digitization. I appreciate Jillian for sharing our wonderful leaflet that addresses just that. So thank you for answering that for me. It's exactly what I would have said. Kim asked about sharing the slide deck. I answered that question. And I know we're at 132 here, so if folks have to leave, that's fine. I just want to see if I can finish the scroll here. Does any DCC have a forum? Interesting. That's a really great question. We don't, but as Jillian suggests, professional organizations are a great place to post questions to. Also, I see a lot of folks post, depends on if you use Facebook or not. People really like the archivists think tank group on Facebook, and I see a lot of questions get posted there to have like peers and colleagues respond with advice. So I feel like people really like that as a resource. I really like the professional organization. Depending on your region, there's probably a regional one where you can post to a forum, and folks have such great advice there. It's a great idea. And I also, again, you can email us. Florida environmental factors are our biggest challenge. Yeah, it's really depending on your area of the United States, especially. It can be wildly vary. Do you have any specific tips to AV materials? That I could go on for a while. We do have some great AV leaflets, and we do have some webinars specifically about AV. The thing I would suggest you do is actually we have a fundamentals of AV preservation, also free online textbook. So if you go on our website, and I can try to find that, there is a textbook just about AV preservation, because yeah, it does sort of have a different set of tips, although a lot of the big picture best practice that we talked about today also applies. You are welcome, everyone. How to handle sticky notes that have necessary information. We have sticky notes in the back of photo prints that contain information to retain. I think Belle's suggestion is great, right? Transferring that information onto a new enclosure. I think taking a picture or a scan and then, attaching that information in some way, putting it in the same enclosure is a great idea. You could also put it in like a record on your cataloging system, or do both. Scrolls that are stored rolled in their own enclosures. Yeah. Okay. Great suggestions to everyone. Okay. I'm wondering if spiral binding should be removed from booklets. And Anna says they remove the spirals. Yeah. That's just a really great question. I have really in processing never had to deal with spiral binding. I'd have to think more about that, but I like Anna's response. And I would have to ask our book conservator if she has additional thoughts on that. Well, thank you all for sticking through this and kind of our speed question and answer round. I think I kind of got to most things. If I somehow missed your question in the chat, again, please feel free to email us, follow up with any other additional questions, thoughts and concerns. And please also take the survey on the Learning Hub. That kind of feedback is really, really critical to us. So taking a couple minutes to do that is so helpful. Okay, well, thank you all and have a great rest of your day.